When most people hear the word Africa, they think of exquisite safaris and beautiful animals, but few think of the millions of people that die every year from HIV/AIDS. AIDS has drastically changed the world, impacting people economically, socially, culturally, and politically. Africa, unfortunately, bears the burden of an HIV/AIDS epidemic, with millions of fatalities and millions more living with the results of that epidemic. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, and it is a severe disorder caused by the retrovirus HIV, resulting in a defect in cell-mediated immune response. This leads to increased susceptibility to opportunistic infections that essentially wears down the immune system. Ultimately, an infected person dies from common sicknesses that normally would be blocked by the immune system. HIV is transmitted through blood, semen, and vaginal secretions. To help understand all this, here's a short clip on the stats and effects of AIDS and how it impacts the world, specifically in Africa. This epidemic results in a circle of never-ending problems. Without the proper resources to combat the epidemic, Africans face a bleak future. Many contend that there are both historical and contemporary factors that influence the AIDS epidemic in Africa. Historically, the problem is rooted in colonialism and the social and economic impact of the slave trade, whereas currently, the lack of education and extreme poverty trap the African nations with the AIDS epidemic and the fallout of that epidemic. With that said, there is a lack of awareness of prevention methods, and discussion of those methods is culturally taboo. In many African countries, it is considered improper and unnecessary to discuss sex and safe sex practices. This leads to the lack of knowledge regarding reproductive health. There are several myths that some of the men and women in Africa actually believe about how AIDS can be transmitted. For example,
I heard you can get it from eating an apple or orange.
It can be transmitted by looking at a person.
This lack of education continues, and people don't have a clear understanding of how it is spread. There are not only misunderstandings, but also some people don't believe it is a real disease or the reality of its transmission. When the disease first started to break out in the 1980s, many questions remained unanswered. Most significantly, what causes AIDS and how is it transmitted? Governments still continue to ignore the importance of AIDS prevention services, leaving the people with little to no information about the subject. Studies show that there is a direct connection between the location of AIDS prevention centers in Africa and the disease's growth. That is, in the locations where there are treatment centers, the disease is noticeably decreased compared to the locations where there are no AIDS prevention centers. The education requires money for the programs to be implemented, and the African governments lack those economic resources. Initially, because of the economic demands, many senior leaders were unaware or denied that AIDS was an issue, which resulted in a lack of funding for the awareness programs. The most effective way to improve this issue is through funding, which may take time, but is necessary in order to fix this problem. In order to provide education, the economy must thrive. The U.S. Census Bureau projected that by the year 2010, 71 million sub-Saharan Africans died from AIDS. AIDS impacts those able to work and the productivity of the country. 80% of those dying from AIDS are between the ages 20 and 50, the prime working years for most people. Another very depressing figure is that by the year 2014, a projected 40 million children will be orphans. This hurts the economy today, but will hurt the African economy of the future. And this could perhaps eventually lead to an entire continent with no guidance for the future, leading to social and cultural problems. Finally, a big problem for African countries is their lack of money and resources to pay for the expensive drug regimen that slows the disease. Preventative education, providing resources for families and orphans, and enabling people to get the drugs necessary to control the disease all require money that the African governments cannot provide. Historically, the impact of European settlers making imperialistic rulings on African nation-states and countries had long-term effects on Africa, socially, economically, and politically. Social problems occurred when Great Britain colonized Sierra Leone. Europeans made a point to rule over colonized regions in order to send resources to the mother country, leaving Africa with little supplies to survive. Originally, the rulers started dividing nation-states north to south, when naturally, the natives had successfully worked with states they knew west to east. The new divisions caused a shift in the power of the Africans, and by the time Europeans left, there was little strength between nation-states, and there was confusion and a disability to achieve power. In addition, the borders and boundaries set by the ruling nations in Africa often separated tribes and cultures. This broke apart families and caused stress and fragmentation of the people. Without strong family ties and the cooperation that results from those ties, the Africans were not as strong culturally, economically, or politically. Once Europeans left Africa, Africans were completely disabled and confused. There was so much conflict that there was a civil war. After the war, people moved around from different regions in Africa to work. They had no power and they became slaves to the Europeans. The Europeans stripped Africa of many of their resources, which caused exploitation of the land. They took everything the land had to offer in terms of resources and sent those back to their home country. Europeans gained wealth and power while Africans were worked with no reward. This led to extreme poverty and barely any resources left in the African communities. The African people were stripped of their economic opportunity. A huge factor in how Africa would function was colonialism. When Europeans migrated and colonized Africa, they took complete control over its economic and political stability. Imperialism from Europe controlled Africa, taking over the African countries and installing their own way of living. This was not productive because mother countries were destroying ethnic groups and causing civil wars between smaller nations. With all this crisis going on, it led to Africa not having any resources, leading to failure of nation-states developing later on. Again, Europeans stripped Africa of all their resources, diminishing any possibilities to run a well-structured economy and industrial system. The colonization was aimed to gain as much as possible for Europe and exploit the African land and natives. During this time period, there were no advancements for the people considering they were always working as slaves. There was barely anything for the people to utilize, which led to many people stealing and fighting over any wealth possible, which still happens currently today. In conclusion, AIDS has impacted the world, but most importantly has changed economic, social, and political welfare of Africa. While the historical factors that influence the epidemic of AIDS in Africa can be identified as colonialism and greed, the contemporary factors that keep Africans struggling with the disease are lack of economic opportunities. Through AIDS prevention programs and their helpful resources, awareness campaigns, HIV screenings, and a shift in attitudes, there can be a reduction in the incidence of AIDS in Africa. An improvement in the healthcare system and delivery of those services is also vital to the survival of Africa. Without economic help from other nations, the African governments cannot survive and deliver the much-needed programs and services. You might be thinking, Hank, can this epidemic ever end? Right now, without a cure, the chances seem low. The spread of the disease can be reduced. The number of orphans can decrease. Other nations must help respond for the need of education, economic opportunity, and adequate health care. The choice is in our hands.